Welcome to a new episode of Film Seizure at the Movies. I am Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure that you can catch each Wednesday morning with my cohorts Jason Oliver and Chuck Moore, and my solo show Monster Mondays that you can listen to each Monday afternoon. You can catch both of these shows at filmseizure.com. Oddly enough, April 2023 is turning into something of a halfway to Halloween movie schedule. The month has two very high-profile, big-budget monster movies that will be covered here shortly. And on top of that, there is a movie starring Academy Award winner Russell Crowe about an exorcist, also distributed by a major studio. For some reason, horror just really wanted to get out in the world for the spring of this year. So this episode will look at Universal's Renfield, starring Nicholas Hoult, Awkwafina, and Nicolas Cage, and then we'll turn my attention to a couple of movies I actually watched in March: Evil Dead Rise, which is soon to hit theaters, and Subspecies V Bloodrise, which should hit home video by the summer. So let's start with Evil Dead Rise.
This evil creates terror through total chaos.
The Deadites are back in Evil Dead Rise from executive producers Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell, and from director Lee Cronin. This is only the second feature film from Irish director Cronin after 2019's The Hole in the Ground. Cronin is definitely bringing a different energy to this series with this entry, and then it's kind of a loose franchise at this point that started with 1981's The Evil Dead. This review comes to you early thanks to my recent visit to Horror Hound Weekend in Cincinnati back in March. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The film is going to be released on April 21st. The Evil Dead started Sam Raimi's career, basically. It's a fairly serious take on kind of a budget in this case. It's a group of young adults who go to a cabin and discover a weird book that is bound in human flesh and has all sorts of creepy stuff in it. A demonic spirit is unleashed and it begins ripping through the friends until only Ash, a fresh-faced Bruce Campbell, remains. Evil Dead 2 is kind of a part sequel and part remake of sorts, as it kind of resets the stage of Ash and girlfriend Linda going to a cabin, finding the Necronomicon, the Book of the Dead, and unleashing a demonic presence and so forth. If you want to know more about those movies, particularly those first two, come back later this year for my Monster Mondays episodes on them that will be out in the fall. The third film of the series, Army of Darkness, goes big and wild with Ash ending up back in the Dark Ages fighting the Deadites. Long story short, he gets back to the present, but not without some hijinks that ensue. In 2013, Fede Alvarez co-wrote and directed a reimagining of sorts of the original film and really laid into some pretty dark and serious stuff, in that a group of friends are at the cabin to help one of the friends, a girl in this case, overcome withdrawal symptoms from a drug addiction. It's bloody. It really was a well thought out reimagining and made Evil Dead truly scary. Kind of more along back to kind of the more serious angle that the original one had. But here we are now in 2023 with Evil Dead Rise. It is keeping with the much more serious and darker tones in this installment. We meet Beth, the younger sister of Ellie. And Ellie lives in an LA apartment building that has been condemned. And Beth is going to visit Ellie, who is also a recently single mother after her husband left. She's raising two teenage kids, a son who is at least 16 years old, as he does drive a car early on, and a daughter who is nearly driving age because the son makes reference to that. She also has a third child who is a young daughter. Now, after the son, Danny, finds a long stashed cache of notes and records belonging to a Catholic scholar, along with a book with a very peculiar leather binding and a locking mechanism on it that pretty much looks like sharp monster teeth, he gets a little too curious, and soon Ellie, his mother, is possessed by the evil demonic force unleashed from the Necronomicon. Now, Mommy is stalking her family and the few remaining residents that live on their floor. Most definitely, Evil Dead Rise is a slick movie. It's well shot. It's well acted. I particularly liked Lily Sullivan as Beth, who is this kind of... she's kind of this character who has made mistakes in her life. Seems like she's consistently running away or being distracted by her own stuff that's going on that makes it very difficult for her and Ellie to really kind of connect on a really meaningful level when Ellie needed her sister the most. That's a really decent character, and there's a real strength that character begins to possess as the course of the movie plays out. I also quite liked Alyssa Sutherland as the very disturbing Ellie. And there's also newcomer Nell Fisher as the youngest child of Ellie's, named Cassie. Alyssa Sutherland is particularly creepy with her movements and how she positions a very lithe body and features. She's very slender, and she cuts a very kind of creepy silhouette throughout this movie. Now, she also has moments that do induce laughter from the audience in a good way. There is a playfulness with the spirit that's possessing her. Ellie has to try to trick her way back into the apartment after she's been locked out by Beth. So she says some deliciously evil but chuckle-worthy dialogue when she is trying to talk to Beth and Cassie about trying to let her back into the apartment. Now, I'm not going to spoil anything. However, if you think these kids are going to escape this unscathed, you are sadly mistaken. And this is more than kids in danger like we see in classics like The Goonies or other movies back in the 80s. No, these kids are being hunted by an evil force that in entries past did not care if you liked the character or not as an audience. The Deadites will get them. So there is this bleakness to the movie that I do kind of appreciate. There's some truly cringe-inducing violence, and I mean that in the actual sense of the word cringe. Shards of glass are shoved through hands. Knives are plunged into biceps. Cheese graters are used on legs. Butcher knives are shoved into torsos. And there's about 27,000 gallons of blood dumped all over this movie. I do absolutely adore the setting, the way it's shot, the acting. And there are stakes at play here that involve children. In the screening that I was able to see of this, Bruce Campbell was there, and he was kind of introducing the movie, and he talked about Lee Cronin introducing a much more Euro horror. And if I were to quote him properly, he says he does Euro shit in this, and it's true. This is more than just your typical American bloodfest or slasher movie or anything like that. There are some things in here that are religious in nature or kind of prey upon senses and stuff like that, like a Euro horror film would. So these are all things that are definite positives in Evil Dead Rise. But that said, I did feel like something was missing. Yes, all those cringe-inducing bloody violent stuff that happens, all that stuff is good. But I kept waiting for the movie to go the next step. I wanted to be disturbed by the movie, and I just kind of wasn't. For all the good things that this movie does, it never pushes the envelope to take us over the edge to see something we haven't seen before. There's a wonderful melding of Evil Dead and the inspiration of the Necronomicon, which is H.P. Lovecraft. That was really neat, but each time that I felt myself sliding to the edge of my seat, waiting to jump back and hide my eyes, it just didn't happen. It really is one of those movies that does everything right, but it simply kind of doesn't stick the landing. It's like, I imagine being a judge watching a very technically sound gymnastics routine. Every single thing is done right. However, the routine is missing the parts that should wow the judge. It should take the extra chances. If it fails, it fails, but if, and that's fine because you took the chance. I appreciate chances being made more than chances being missed. But if it does land, the whole thing comes together and you are scoring this a gold medal performance. But instead, the perfectly fine routine that it is, without those big moments, kind of only ends up becoming adequate. One last thing, I found myself waiting for a twist because I couldn't quite understand the rules of who would turn into a Deadite after they've been attacked or injured by the Ellie character, and who won't become a Deadite. It kept dragging me back to the question when I should be keeping up with the movie. But anyway, Evil Dead Rise is going to please horror and gore hounds, and it really will please big fans of the Evil Dead franchise. I was generally pleased. Again, it does everything it planned to do on a technical level just fine, but it's only just that. So with that, I kind of have to score Evil Dead Rise a grade of a soft B-, where a couple of really big moments, if it landed well, would have propelled this instantly to the top of the movies of the year, and it just wasn't there. But generally, a good movie, a good entry in the Evil Dead franchise, a movie that I'll gladly see again, and I was very glad to see it. I was very glad to wait for 2 hours in line to get this special screening. I just wish it pushed a little bit more on a couple of places where it could be really, really disturbing that you have a mother potentially killing her own children. As dark as that sounds, it just misses the mark on some of that stuff where it could have really, really pushed that envelope.
Mom? Mommy's with the maggots now.
All right, so now let's see if we can find Dracula a bite to eat.
Renfield, welcome. I am Dracula.
Dracula. It's a name that anyone over the age of 7 should probably know. There are few fictional characters who have appeared in more movies and TV shows. In fact, there's very little to think that any vampire character isn't directly related to or purposely trying to avoid being too much like Dracula. The character also goes back to 1922 in film with F.W. Murnau's beautiful Nosferatu. Now, granted, he couldn't be named Dracula in that, but it is adapted from Bram Stoker's 1897 novel. And it turns out that 2023 might just be the year of Dracula, as not only will Nosferatu get a third adaptation when Robert Eggers finishes his production later this year, but a singular chapter from Stoker's novel is being turned into a film too, with Universal and DreamWorks' The Last Voyage of the Demeter coming out in August. And speaking of Universal, the company here in the United States probably most directly attached to the count, if you will. We have the action comedy horror film Renfield, starring Nicholas Hoult, Awkwafina, and featuring Nicolas Cage as Dracula. Now, this is something that I've been looking forward to since this announcement, and the trailer started showing in front of movies probably sometime late last year. This comes from a story by Robert Kirkman, the man who created the immensely popular comic and TV show The Walking Dead, and directed by Chris McKay, who made the Lego Batman movie and came up with the story for the recent Dungeons & Dragons film that is quite entertaining and probably is the best film I've seen so far this year. I should also mention that McKay had a great deal to do with, as far as writing and directing, episodes of a couple of great Adult Swim series, Moral Oral and Robot Chicken. But let's talk for a second about Nicolas Cage playing it over the top and very thirsty Count Dracula. I think when it was revealed that Cage would be the vampiric nobleman from Romania's Carpathian Mountains, we all thought, wow, yes, more of this, please. Then we could see him in the trailers, and wow, Cage has to be having a great time lately, kind of playing his usual out-of-control self in big-budget movies. Last year, he was in one of the more original and purely entertaining movies of the year with The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent. This was shortly after making a big splash in the indie mind trip horror film Mandy, where he could really unleash there, too. While Cage movies are often made on a scant budget and he's hired to mostly have big over-the-top scenes, when he works with someone who knows how to use his energy, like with the two movies I just previously mentioned, it can almost come off as magical. I'm not sure there is another actor like Cage in movies today. You hire him to be him, but you also know you're not going to get any kind of a phoned-in performance from this kind of ball of chaos energy that he brings. So, in Renfield, we follow Holt's Robert Montague Renfield as Dracula's decades-long familiar as he struggles to serve his master satisfactorily. He tends to Dracula's needs in battle against vampire hunters and clergymen. He keeps his home. He supplies Dracula with victims to help feed him. However, after so long, Dracula is running out of places to live where he can remain mostly in the shadows and out of the notice of most people. It's also true that his vast wealth is nearly depleted. Dracula and Renfield have recently relocated to New Orleans, where they live in an abandoned, creepy hospital. What's more, Renfield is starting to yearn for his old life as a human again. And you see, now he's not quite human and he's not a vampire. In exchange for serving Dracula, Renfield can gain power from feeding on insects and spiders. Their life force basically gives him the power to overpower the victims that he then brings to Dracula. As Renfield's loneliness starts to kind of overtake him, he uses that power to bring Dracula those who kind of deserve it by making other people's lives difficult and unhappy. But when Dracula yearns for more power and control and Renfield kills people who were involved with stolen cocaine that leads the Lobos, a powerful drug cartel in New Orleans, to start getting quite interested in this Renfield character, things start to fall off the rails. And it's up to Renfield and the only other person that he can trust, Awkwafina's policewoman Rebecca Quincy, to stop Dracula and bring down this cartel to essentially save the city. Now, I very much like Cage's portrayal of Dracula as this ghoul who almost seems to leap off the screen from Lugosi's time and exist in this world of this movie. In fact, there are some really clever deepfake work in this movie that places Cage in Lugosi's place and Holt in the place of Dwight Fry from the 1931 Universal classic early on, while Holt explains the whole backstory to catch the viewers up to the modern day. He also is mildly foppish and kind of has an interesting energy with Renfield that borders on homoerotic in a very platonic way, if that makes sense. Dracula is beyond sexuality, basically. He even says so in so many words by just saying, I feed on boys, I feed on girls. It doesn't really matter to him. He's a monster. That sort of stuff is beyond him. But for about half of this movie, I also kind of enjoyed Holt's near Hugh Grant impersonation as this shy and kind of bumbling lackey. But this is where my enjoyment of this movie stops. This is a wide miss of a movie. That Grant impersonation got me thinking that this movie almost has this 90s feel to it. It's like the script was unearthed from a box that read 1995's best rejected scripts and was filmed with no changes or rewrites whatsoever. Awkwafina, an actress I actually quite like and someone that I feel naturally kind of has this likability to her, kind of comes off almost phoning this in. She's consistently one note. She's doing what she's asked and she consistently strikes that note, but it comes across to boring results, if I'm being honest. This movie also feels like it was edited to hell and back, too. There feels like entire chunks are missing from this movie. I mean, we go so fast from Renfield being loyal to suddenly needing to break free from Dracula with very little indication as to why he would do that. You have to remember, Renfield is mystically, like, attached to Dracula. Just because he sees somebody that he kind of suddenly has any kind of appreciation for, that's not enough to break him free from Dracula. So I feel like there has to be some missing connective tissue there. Like I said, there has to be at least one or two scenes completely chopped out that would help with the main character's motivations. The movie's pace is fast. I get it. It's a comedy that wants to keep things kind of peppy and quirky, but it's too fast. There are things that I feel like are rushed through so that we can get to the next ridiculous fight sequence that results in buckets of blood being spilled. But there's a trio of problems that make this almost inexcusably bad, if I'm being honest. I could give this movie a pass if the movie was at least nailing jokes, even if the editing was sloppy, even if the story was all over the place, but this movie is not funny. It's really something to sit in the theater on opening night, about half full or a little bit better, presumably with people just as taken by the quirky trailer as I was, and there are very, very, very few times in which you hear laughter. The jokes are just kind of lame. They don't really work. The best jokes are in the trailer or are too gory to show in a trailer. And the idea of Nicolas Cage finally ascending to play the Lord of the Vampires, I mean, I guess that's one thing to kind of chuckle about. And he is certainly the best thing to watch in this movie. But there are a couple of really funny moments that do deal with gore, but those are so few and far between, and you can't hinge all of the comedy on them. That you can't even really get your kicks off the absurdity of that gore and have the movie work by using that to kind of make light of it. Look, I love it when our hero uses a bad guy's detached arms to beat up other bad guys, but that also can't be overdone. So I guess the movie is trapped by knowing the over-the-top blood is used as a joke, but you also can't do that joke time and time again. Another issue is that when the movie isn't working for you on a joke level, seeing how this is a comedy, you begin to wander in your thoughts and your eyes start to notice other things that just don't look good. For instance, there's a moment that Dracula discovers Renfield's support group that is helping him kind of stand up to his master and giving him the confidence to act in his own interest. Now, Dracula operates by night, right? Right. So we should know that he's out and about this night in particular. So he goes to Renfield's apartment, and the windows are darkened there. When Renfield goes to warn his support group, we can visibly see it's dark outside when he opens the door. And we can also see that it's dark outside on that level, on that first level windows in this gymnasium. However, on set with the support group scene, when it's filmed, we can actually clearly see bright daytime skies in the windows that are higher up in that gymnasium where these scenes are filmed. That's inexcusable. That's such a screw up that it makes you think that there was little care put into this. I bet it wouldn't take much for this scene alone for the FX guys to come in and make it look like it's dark outside in those windows in those 6 to 8 shots where we can see that clear blue sky outside those higher up windows. I mean, that's atrocious. And I found myself chuckling at such an obvious goof. It's also another sign of poor editing and I could be wrong, but I would feel like the editor should have raised this to anyone, that the continuity of the time of day is completely and totally shattered. And finally, I have described Renfield as a hero, right? Well, if he's got a change of heart about serving Dracula, shouldn't we be a little weary about how he feels about all those other people he's delivered to Dracula during about, 100 years of service or more? There isn't much mention about that. Sure, Renfield lost his wife and child when he went to meet Dracula. That's brought up, but it's never held on to for long enough to feel like Renfield cares or that we feel sympathy for him. Dracula does use it as a dagger at one point to gaslight Renfield, but I don't even find myself caring all that much when he finally does stand up for himself and kind of does the things he needs to do in order to win his freedom. I shouldn't have to find myself thinking about whether or not our lead protagonist is remorseful for all the souls and lives he helped end, essentially, to feed Dracula. Okay, wait. I should say I shouldn't have to find myself thinking about that in such a silly fantasy comedy, which I thought this was. But to go back to that first inexcusable problem of this movie, it's just simply not funny. This is a massive disappointment, and I hate that this is about as toothless as an old vampire who needs dentures. So I have to give this a paltry and anemic D+.
You know when something crazy happens and someone's like, it's okay, I've seen way worse? Everything I saw you do today is going to be my way worse.
But good news, there is a movie that I wasn't disappointed by, and it also features a long-running vampire character to boot. So let's shift gears to another sneak peek that I got to indulge in.
We have come for the Bloodstone.
What is your name, Crusader? Radu.
Lastly, to round out this trio of spooky April movies, as I mentioned earlier, I attended Horror Hound Weekend in Cincinnati during the weekend of March 24th through 26th at the Sharonville Convention Center. For the first time since 2019, in the days before COVID-19 became a vampiric entity that sucked the fun out of everything, it felt that Horror Hound was really kind of coming back with a vengeance. They were having a lot of movies play. They had a lot of guests show up. There was a lot of activity there. The place was packed. It was sold out. It was just really great to see everything kind of back to normal after really 2020, 2021, and 2022 just really being kind of a sad state of affairs, not necessarily with the convention. That's not what I mean at all, but a sad state of affairs in the world where you just didn't feel right getting back to anything. But not only did they score the second ever audience to be able to see Evil Dead Rise after it played at South by Southwest, which is where I saw Evil Dead Rise, so I could give that review earlier in this episode. But they made a point to call out world premieres for the horror shorts and movies that were playing during their film festival that weekend. Now, one of the early ones that was announced for this that would be a world premiere was Subspecies V, Bloodrise from Full Moon Pictures, and producer Charles Band, and the original series director Ted Nicolau. Also returning were stars from the original four films from the 90s. You had Denise Duff, who in the 90s played the heroine Michelle Morgan in the last three movies. And maybe most importantly was the return of Anis Hove as Radu Vladislas, our Romanian vampire from all of the previous films. Now, what's interesting about coming into this new era of full moon films that are trying to revisit kind of like their greatest hits or maybe their greatest series is that it's clear that Charles Band is being very careful about how he's handling these legacy series. I'm not going to lie, sometimes it's hard to pin down the expectation for a full moon film. I've seen some that are exceptionally well shot, or at the very least has a very likable charm to it that surpasses any kind of budgetary issues. I've seen others that are real slipshod, that come out looking like they're shot on low quality video with kind of static blocking and setup of shots, and really kind of selling itself simply on really crazy ideas or titles. I get it, Mr. Band. I mean, you're keeping Full Moon afloat by weighing the budget against those bonker monster ideas. I can't be too hard on that. So when I saw that Subspecies was going to get a long-awaited 5th entry, I was cautiously optimistic. I covered all 4 Subspecies films at my site B Movie Anima way back in June 2019. I generally like all of those films. Some are definitely stronger than others, but there's a particular look and style to them that make them my clear favorite of any series from Full Moon. Hove and Duff are really good in their roles. Nicolau has an eye for how to shoot the moody landscape of Romania. Generally, it's engaging, especially if you like vampires and movies that deal with vampires. What I hoped wouldn't happen would be the 5th one to come out, look stiff or shot on video, and generally fail to provide any of the previous charm, and leave the movie looking and feeling kind of cheap to kind of cash in on the series name. But I'm very happy to report that that isn't the case with Subspecies V, Bloodrise. There's a fairly decent amount of effort placed into this movie to look like a worthy entry in the saga of Radu Vladislas. And I would struggle to call what happens in Subspecies V as a plot, per se. Really what this movie is can be summed up as a set of connected, maybe set pieces that tell the tale of Radu as he goes from being a crusading knight who seeks out hives of vampires who he then kills and basically consecrates the shelter so that they can't return to that place. He's pretty good at his job until he meets Elena, a woman who was kept as a prisoner of Radu's father, Prince Vladislas, for a real monster. He's kind of a real monster, vampire monster. The prince used Elena to be basically a vessel to give birth to a child named Stefan. Radu immediately takes a liking to both Elena for her beauty and his half-brother Stefan because he too, Radu, was also an offspring of the prince, but was taken away to be raised in the church to be a hunter. Now the important stuff is pretty much front-loaded, as Helena, played by Denise Duff, is directly responsible for Radu's transformation into a vampire. And from there, the plot starts to kind of break up into vignettes of sorts of Radu taking in fledglings, a pair of musicians that he seduced by saying that the lasting life he offered would basically make their work, their music, live on throughout centuries. And then it goes kind of back and forth of, how Radu basically is telling these tales of how these fledglings would ultimately betray him, return to him, lose their inspiration to create music, and so on and so forth. This would eventually bring the movie back full circle and back to Helena and Prince Vladislas, and set into motion a curse that would later link Radu to Michelle, who's the character that Denise Duff played in the 90s, and, kind of set up their whole relationship for those original 4 Subspecies films. Generally, I do like this movie. I could say that I didn't really ask for the story. I could even say that I would have rather see the series carry on and see what was going on in the 25 years after Bloodstorm, which was the 4th entry. I'm saying I'm not entirely sure what it was I necessarily wanted out of a 5th Subspecies movie, but what was made is a fine entry. It's a movie in which you do kind of find yourself citing Radu, if by no other way, just simply because you're following him along in the movie. The movie does look and feel like a Subspecies movie. Hove is a compelling actor. There was no beats missed in the 25 years since he played that character originally. I very much appreciated bringing Duff back in, even if she wasn't playing the same character that she'd played in the 3 previous entries. It does end up creating a good symmetry with her casting and how it connects to those other movies that take place technically hundreds of years later. And it simply worked for me. I also like that there is kind of a cheeky backdoor way to continue the series beyond this movie and feature a new character in the lead. So with that all said, I am going to give Bloodrise a grade of a pretty affectionate B. I enjoyed seeing this world revisited, even if it was in kind of a prequel style story, and it has to cover a lot of years in a relatively short period of runtime. But it's a good looking movie, and Hannes Hove is a treasure to see back as Radu. If you're a fan of the Subspecies series, I definitely recommend Bloodrise. It's not a cheap cash-in on the name. It's pretty high-quality Full Moon, which is what I definitely wanted from this new entry. And it's definitely what I like about those earlier entries as well. And I'm glad to see that they were able to maximize the location and the quality by simply limiting the cast. It's a small story that centers directly on Radu, which is perfect too. And by doing so, it really gives us a much higher budget look than what you would typically expect to see from Full Moon and some of the other non-legacy, non-series films that they produce. They really did a good job resurrecting this series, and I think we have a real good shot at seeing what comes later on.
Life or death. This choice is yours.
Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram so that you can be made aware of new episodes of our various shows as they drop. You can also follow us at podcast providers like SoundCloud, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spotify, and Audible. And you can also listen to the show on YouTube by subscribing there. In a few weeks, I'll be back to take a look at the new Marvel Studios release, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, which brings to close that saga of that spacefaring superhero team. So until then, don't forget to save me the aisle seat.